It began with a glint, a tiny yellowish flake of metal, smaller than a pea, caught in the channel of a sawmill built by a quiet carpenter on a remote California river. That single spark, discovered in January of 1848, ignited a fire that would consume the world. It emptied cities, launched 1,000 ships, and pulled an army of over 300,000 people across oceans and continents, all driven by a single, intoxicating promise: instant, unimaginable wealth. It was the birth of the American dream, in its most raw and dangerous form. But for every man who struck it rich, 100 were broken. The promise of paradise was a lie. The real story of the California gold rush is not a tale of fortunes made. It's a terrifying story of survival. It's a story of desperate men dying of thirst in deserts, rotting from scurvy on nightmare voyages, and succumbing to cholera in crowded, lawless camps. It's the story of a peaceful land turned into a violent, chaotic battlefield, and the story of how the dream of gold led to the systematic destruction of an entire people. This is the truth of the 49ers, a story not of gold, but of grit, greed, and ghosts. Part 1. The Spark and the Fever. Chapter 1. The Man, the Mill, and the Secret. Before the world changed, California was a quiet, sun-baked paradise, sparsely populated and largely forgotten. It was technically Mexican territory, though its days under that flag were numbered. The United States was in the final days of its war with Mexico, a conflict that would soon, and formally, cede this vast territory, along with the entire Southwest, to the Americans. But in the winter of 1848, it was a remote pastoral land. A few thousand Californios, Hispanic settlers, lived on massive cattle ranches, or ranchos, while the vast interior was home to tens of thousands of Native Americans, including the Miwok, Maidu, and Nisenan, who had lived there for millennia. One of the most powerful men in this sleepy land was John Sutter. Sutter was not a simple frontiersman. He was a charismatic, deeply flawed dreamer, a Swiss immigrant who had fled Europe one step ahead of his creditors. He had reinvented himself in America, convincing the Mexican government to grant him a 50,000-acre feudal kingdom in the Sacramento Valley. He called his settlement New Helvetia, or New Switzerland. His fort, Sutter's Fort, was the first stop for weary pioneers who had just survived the brutal overland journey on the California Trail. Sutter's dream was not to find gold. It was to build an agricultural empire of wheat, cattle, and lumber. To build this empire, he needed wood. He partnered with a quiet, meticulous carpenter from New Jersey named James W. Marshall. Marshall was tasked with finding a suitable location for a new sawmill, far up in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. He found the perfect spot on the South Fork of the American River, a place the local Nisenan people called Coloma, or Beautiful Valley. On the cold, clear morning of January 24th, 1848, Marshall was inspecting the tail race of his nearly completed mill. This was the channel designed to carry water away from the giant wheel. To deepen it, his crew had spent the night diverting the river, allowing the powerful current to scour the channel's bed. As Marshall walked the damp, muddy ditch, a glint of light in the dawn sun caught his eye. He bent down. There, lodged against a piece of bedrock, were a few small, yellowish flakes. He picked one up. It was heavy and it was soft. He hammered it on a rock and it didn't break or shatter like pyrite, fool's gold. It bent. A jolt of recognition, a mixture of awe and dread, ran through him. He gathered the flakes in his hat, and days later rode through a rainstorm nearly 50 miles away to Sutter's Fort. He burst into his office, soaked to the bone, and demanded they be alone. "I have made a discovery that will make or ruin us," he declared. He unwrapped his bundle, revealing the small, heavy particles. Sutter, who had a copy of an old encyclopedia, performed a few crude tests. They weighed the flakes against silver. They doused them in lye and vinegar. The material remained unchanged, gleaming in the candlelight. Sutter's reaction was not joy, it was terror. He understood, in a way Marshall could not, what this meant. "Gold," he wrote in his diary, "is a terrible thing." He knew this discovery would be the end of his agricultural dream. It would bring a flood of lawless, uncontrollable men who would trample his crops, steal his cattle, and squat on his land. His kingdom was doomed. He and Marshall swore their crew to secrecy. It was a futile, desperate attempt to hold back the tide, but a secret this big could not be kept. Chapter 2. The whispers become a roar. For the first few months, the secret held, mostly because no one believed it. The news, when it leaked, was just a whisper. A teamster visiting the mill mentioned it to a storekeeper. A child of one of the mill workers showed a small flake to a neighbor. The stories were dismissed as tall tales. The first person to truly understand the scale of it was a shrewd, energetic merchant in San Francisco named Sam Brannan. Brannan was a Mormon elder who ran a small general store and published the California Star, one of the only newspapers in the tiny port settlement. When he heard the rumors, he went to see for himself. He visited the mill, saw the diggings, and immediately his mind saw not gold, but profit. Brannan began to quietly buy up every pickaxe, shovel, flour sack, and blanket he could find. He mortgaged his property to corner the market on mining supplies. Then, when his warehouse was full, he acted. On a spring day in May 1848, Sam Brannan ran through the dusty streets of San Francisco, a small vial full of gold dust in one hand and a copy of his newspaper in the other. He waved the vial and bellowed the words that would change the world. "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." His story, published in his own paper, confirmed the rumors. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. San Francisco, a town of perhaps 900 people, emptied overnight. Shopkeepers nailed their doors shut, soldiers deserted their posts, sailors abandoned their ships in the bay, leaving a forest of masts to rot in the harbor. The town's 2 newspapers had to shut down because the entire staff, editors, printers, and all, had run for the hills. The gold rush had begun in California. Still, the news had not yet reached the East Coast or the rest of the world. In the mid-19th century, information traveled at the speed of a ship. Letters from California took months to round Cape Horn or cross the Isthmus of Panama. The first reports that trickled into Eastern newspapers were buried on the back pages, treated as unbelievable frontier exaggerations. The man who turned the California fever into a global pandemic was, ironically, the President of the United States. On December 5, 1848, President James K. Polk, in his final State of the Union address to Congress, sought to justify the recent war with Mexico and the vast new territory the U.S. had acquired. To do this, he needed proof that the land was valuable. He held up a report from Colonel Richard Mason, the military governor of California, which included an official U.S. government confirmation of the discovery. His words were clinical, but their impact was explosive. He confirmed it. It was official. It was real. The news hit the East Coast like a bolt of lightning. The next day, every major newspaper led with the story. Gold mania swept the nation. Within weeks, the entire country was consumed by a single obsession. Preachers, lawyers, doctors, farmers, and clerks were all struck by the same fever. Why work for a year to earn a few $100s when a man in California could supposedly scoop that much out of a riverbed in a single day? The world caught the fever next. The news spread to Europe, to Australia, to China, to South America. Within 6 months, tens of thousands of men, who would collectively become known as the 49ers, were liquidating their homes, kissing their families goodbye, and booking passage for a journey to the end of the world. Chapter 3: The Three Perilous Roads. For a 49er in New York, Boston, or London, the dream of gold was simple. The reality of getting there was a nightmare. There were 3 routes to California, and each was a different kind of gamble with death. Route 1, the sea voyage around Cape Horn. This was the longest route, but considered the safest. It was a grueling 18,000-mile sea journey that could take anywhere from 5 to 8 months. Gold seekers crammed onto hastily refitted whaling ships and cargo vessels, often paying exorbitant prices for a spot in a dark, cramped, and foul-smelling steerage compartment. The journey was a monotonous hell of boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Passengers suffered from seasickness, rats, and food poisoning from spoiled salt beef and maggot-infested hardtack. The greatest test was rounding the Horn, the treacherous passage around the southern tip of South America, where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans collide. Here, ships were battered for weeks on end by hurricane-force winds, rogue waves the size of mountains, and freezing sleet. Ships were dismasted, their hulls breached, and many sank without a trace, taking their gold-seeking passengers with them to a watery grave. Those who survived the Horn then faced the doldrums near the equator, where ships could be becalmed for weeks, their water supplies dwindling under a scorching sun, leading to outbreaks of scurvy and thirst. Route 2, the Panama Shortcut, the Jungle Passage. This was the fast route, advertised as a 30-day journey. It was also the most expensive and arguably the deadliest. The journey involved taking a ship from the east coast to the Isthmus of Panama, crossing 60 miles of dense, disease-ridden jungle, and then catching another ship on the Pacific side to San Francisco. The reality was a disaster. The shortcut was a bottleneck from hell. Thousands of men were dumped on the Atlantic coast of Panama, in the overflowing town of Chagres, to find that the easy passage across the isthmus was a lie. There was no road. They had to hire local guides with dugout canoes, called bungos, to pole them up the treacherous, fever-infested Chagres River. They journeyed for days through a sweltering jungle plagued by mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever, diseases for which there was no cure. Men who arrived healthy were often dead within a week. After the river journey, they faced a 20-mile trek over the mountains on a mule path. When they finally reached Panama City on the Pacific, they found thousands of other desperate, sick men waiting for the few available ships to San Francisco. Ship captains, seeing the demand, extorted astronomical sums, and riots often broke out for a spot on a vessel. Many 49ers died waiting on that beach, their dreams of gold turning to dust in a foreign, fever-ridden land. Route 3, the Overland Trail, the Great Gamble. This was the people's route, the cheapest option for families and those starting from the Midwest. It was a 2,000-mile overland journey following the same path as the Oregon Trail before branching south. It was also a brutal test of endurance. Travelers had to cross the vast, great American desert of the plains, ford raging rivers, and somehow get their oxen-drawn wagons over 2 of the most formidable mountain ranges on the continent, the Rockies, and far worse, the Sierra Nevada. They faced cholera outbreaks that could wipe out half a wagon train in a week. They faced starvation when their supplies ran out, and agonizing thirst in the deserts of Nevada. The final desperate push was over the Sierra Nevada, a towering wall of granite. If they arrived too late in the season, they faced the same fate as the infamous Donner Party just a few years earlier, being trapped by 20-foot snowdrifts and facing a slow death by starvation and cold. Each route was a filter designed to break the body and the spirit. And this was all before they had even seen a single flake of gold. The price of admission to the goldfields was to survive a journey that would kill thousands. The great hunt was on, and the world was rushing headlong into the beautiful, deadly trap that was California.
Part 2. The Reality of the Diggings. Chapter 4. The City Built on Haste. For those who survived the journey, their first glimpse of California was not a golden paradise. It was a chaotic, muddy, and lawless nightmare centered on the once sleepy port of San Francisco. In 1848, San Francisco was a quiet village of perhaps 900 people. By the end of 1849, it was a heaving, frantic, makeshift metropolis of over 30,000. The harbor was a ghostly forest of masts. Hundreds of ships, abandoned by their crews who had immediately deserted for the goldfields, were left to rot in the bay. Some were so completely abandoned that they were simply run aground and built over, their hulls becoming the foundations for the saloons and hotels that sprang up along the waterfront. The city itself was an explosion of raw, unfinished ambition. It was a city of tents, shacks, and flimsy wooden buildings erected almost overnight. The streets were unpaved troughs of mud, inches deep in the dry season and feet deep in the wet. In the infamous mud of the 1849-50 winter, men and mules reportedly drowned in the main streets, the thick, viscous mud sucking them down. In a grotesque display of gallows humor, someone famously stuck a sign in a particularly deep mud hole on Montgomery Street that read, "This street is impassable, not even jackassable." There was no sanitation. The stench of human waste, rotting garbage, and dead animals filled the air. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid tore through the crowded, filthy tent slums, killing men who had survived the perils of Cape Horn or the Panama fever. Everything was driven by a frantic, manic energy. The entire city was a single, sprawling marketplace of desperation. A single egg could cost $1, the equivalent of over $30 today. A loaf of bread cost $2. A shovel, which cost $1 in Boston, sold for $10. A cheap hotel room, often just a louse-infested bunk in a crowded canvas dormitory, could cost $15 a night. A doctor, if one could be found, might charge $100 just to look at a patient. Fortunes were made and lost not just in the goldfields, but by the merchants, saloon keepers, and gamblers who mined the miners. Sam Brannan, the man who had first shouted, "Gold!" became California's first millionaire, not by digging, but by selling shovels and supplies at astronomical markups. And then there were the fires. This city of wood, canvas, and cloth, filled with open flames from cooking fires, candles, and cigars, was a tinderbox. San Francisco was consumed by a series of great fires. In 1849, 1850, and 1851, massive conflagrations swept through the city, turning whole sections to ash in a matter of hours. Each time, the residents, driven by the relentless optimism of the gold fever, would begin rebuilding before the embers were even cold, often with the same flammable materials. It was a city without women, without law, and without order, populated almost entirely by young, armed, and anxious men from every corner of the globe. This was the chaotic gateway to the goldfields, and it was a filter designed to strip the newcomers of their money and their ideals before they even saw a speck of gold. Chapter 5. Life in the Diggings. From San Francisco, the 49ers had to make another arduous journey, traveling by riverboat up the Sacramento or San Joaquin rivers to staging towns like Sacramento or Stockton. From there, they bought mules and supplies at even more inflated prices and walked into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, the area that became known as the Mother Lode. They entered a landscape that had been utterly transformed. The once quiet, wooded valleys were now chaotic, sprawling camps of men.
The rivers were choked with mud, their banks stripped bare of trees. The landscape was turned upside down, pockmarked with thousands of holes, ditches, and trenches. The camps had names that reflected their raw, sudden nature. Hangtown, so named for its early use of vigilante justice, Bedbug, Murderer's Bar, Skunk Gulch, and Hell's Half Acre. Life in these camps was a brutal existence, stripped of all comforts. The men lived in flimsy canvas tents or crude log and mud shacks, often sleeping on the cold, damp ground. Their diet was a monotonous, unhealthy rotation of the same three foods: salt pork, beans, and hardtack, a rock-hard, unleavened biscuit. Fresh fruit and vegetables were almost non-existent. This diet, devoid of vitamin C, led to the sailor's scourge, scurvy. Men who had survived months at sea arrived in the goldfields only to watch their bodies fall apart. Their gums would swell and turn black, their teeth would loosen and fall out, old wounds would reopen, and their joints would ache until they were crippled, eventually dying in agony. Cholera and dysentery, spread by water contaminated with the waste of thousands of men and the mud from their mining operations, were even faster killers, turning a vibrant camp into a graveyard in a matter of days. The work itself was back-breaking, soul-crushing labor, a far cry from the fantasy of picking up nuggets from the ground. The easy gold, the surface deposits and the riverbeds, was gone by the end of 1849. What remained required relentless, painful toil, often 16 hours a day, standing knee-deep in ice-cold mountain water, bent over under the blazing California sun. This relentless, brutal work, combined with the poor diet, physical exhaustion, and the profound disappointment of finding little gold, broke men's bodies and minds. The isolation and the absence of family or the structures of normal society led to widespread depression, alcoholism, and violence. The camps were lawless. A man's only protection was the pistol on his hip and the willingness to use it. Gambling and drinking were the only forms of recreation, and fortunes found in a pan in the morning were often lost at a card table in a saloon tent by nightfall. Chapter 6: The Evolution of Mining. The methods of mining evolved as quickly as the easy gold disappeared, each new method requiring more work, more capital, and more men, transforming mining from an individual's gamble into an industrial enterprise. Phase 1: placer mining, the pan and the cradle. This was the iconic image of the 49er. The earliest arrivals used simple tools. The pan was the most basic. A miner would scoop gravel and mud from a riverbed into a wide, shallow metal pan, fill it with water, and begin a careful process of swirling and tilting. The lighter sand and gravel would wash over the rim, while the heavier gold particles, if any, would settle at the bottom. It was slow, agonizing work. A man might pan all day for a few flakes worth less than $1. A slight improvement was the rocker or cradle. This was a wooden box on rockers, operated by 2 or 3 men. One man would shovel gravel into the top, another would pour buckets of water over it, and a third would rock the cradle back and forth. The water would wash the gravel over a series of riffles, or small ridges, that would trap the heavier gold. It was more efficient than panning, but still brutally hard labor. Phase 2: the long tom and sluicing. As the surface gold vanished, miners had to process more gravel. The long tom was an evolution of the cradle, essentially a long, inclined wooden trough. A stream of water was diverted to flow through it. A team of men would shovel gravel into the upper end, and the water would wash it down, with the gold being trapped by riffles at the lower end. This quickly evolved into sluicing, where multiple long toms were built together, creating massive systems of wooden flumes that stretched for hundreds of yards. These operations required large teams of men, capital to buy lumber, and the engineering skill to divert entire streams. The individual miner was already becoming obsolete, replaced by organized companies of laborers. Phase 3. River damming, the desperate gamble. By 1850, the miners became convinced that the real gold lay in the beds of the rivers themselves, which were now too deep to pan or sluice. In an incredible feat of desperate collective engineering, entire companies of miners would work for months during the dry season to build massive dams of rock and timber, diverting the flow of an entire river, like the Yuba or the American, into a temporary flume. Their goal was to expose the riverbed for a few precious weeks in the late summer, hoping to find it lined with gold. It was the ultimate gamble. They would toil all summer, investing all their time and money, only to find the exposed bedrock was barren. Worse, an early autumn storm could send a flash flood roaring down the canyon, wiping out their dam and their entire season's work in a single devastating moment. Phase 4. Hydraulic mining, the earth destroyer. This was the final, terrible evolution of the gold rush. When the river gold was gone, miners turned to the hills themselves. They found that ancient, dried-up riverbeds, called tertiary gravels, were buried deep within the hillsides. To get to this gold, they invented hydraulic mining. This method involved using massive, high-pressure water cannons called monitors. These cannons fired a devastatingly powerful jet of water at the hillsides, literally blasting them apart. Entire mountains were liquefied, washed into enormous sluice boxes to filter out the gold. This was no longer mining. It was industrial-scale destruction. It sent millions of tons of mud, silt, and rock cascading into the rivers, choking them, causing massive floods downstream in towns like Marysville and Sacramento, and destroying farmland. This method required huge investments in corporations, completing the transition from the hopeful 49er with his pan to a wage-earning industrial laborer for a massive faceless company. The dream of individual wealth that started the rush had by the mid-1850s been completely consumed by the very industrial capitalism it had helped to create. The lone prospector was a myth, and the real gold was now flowing not from the rivers, but into the pockets of the San Francisco bankers and industrialists who own the water and the machines.
Part 3. A Society Unmoored. Chapter 7. A Society Without Law. The tens of thousands of men who flooded into California did not bring government with them. They brought picks, shovels, and pistols. In the chaotic scramble for gold, a profound vacuum of authority was created. California in 1849 was not yet a state. It was a newly conquered military territory. There was no established civil government, no legislature, no tax system, and, most critically, no effective police force or criminal court system. Into this void stepped Judge Lynch. In the absence of formal law, the miners created their own brutal, instantaneous, and often terribly flawed system of justice. In a camp, when a man was accused of a crime, typically theft or murder, a miners' court would be formed on the spot. A judge would be elected from the crowd, a jury of 12 men assembled, and a trial would be held, often lasting no more than an hour. The standards of evidence were non-existent. Hearsay, prejudice, and rumor were treated as fact. A man's guilt or innocence was often decided by the passion of the crowd or the skill of the accuser. The punishments were swift and severe. For minor theft, the sentence was typically flogging, dozens of lashes with a whip, followed by the man's ears being cropped or his cheek branded with a T for thief. For murder, or for the more serious crime of stealing another man's gold or mule, the sentence was almost always death. The convicted man would be marched to the nearest tree, a rope thrown over a branch, and he would be hanged by the neck until dead. This vigilante justice was born of necessity, but it quickly revealed the dark side of popular democracy. It was prone to error, fueled by prejudice and often descended into mere mob rule. In 1849, in the camp that would soon be known as Hangtown, modern-day Placerville, 3 men were accused of robbery and attempted murder. Within minutes, a mob had them under a tree, ready to be hanged. A few skeptical voices in the crowd urged caution, suggesting they wait for a more formal trial. One of the men, who spoke only broken English, was clearly terrified and trying to explain something. But the crowd was drunk and impatient. They were lynched. Later, it was widely believed that at least 2 of the men, and possibly all 3, were innocent. The system was fast and final, but it had no mechanism for appeal or correction. The city of San Francisco was no better. It was terrorized by gangs, most notoriously a group of ex-New York street toughs who called themselves the Hounds or the Regulators. These men, often claiming to be a patriotic police force, would strut through the city, extorting protection money from merchants, beating up Hispanic and Chilean immigrants, and burning down their tents. When they brazenly attacked a Chilean neighborhood in broad daylight, the city's respectable citizens, led by Sam Brannan, had finally had enough. They formed the Committee of Vigilance, a paramilitary organization of several hundred armed men. This Vigilance Committee bypassed the city's powerless officials, hunted down the Hounds' leaders, tried them in a kangaroo court, and banished them from the city. This act, while it solved one problem, set a terrifying precedent. It established a shadow government of armed, wealthy merchants who believed they were the only true source of order. This Vigilance Committee would rise again, most famously in 1851 and 1856, taking the law into its own hands, publicly hanging men in the city square, and effectively running San Francisco as a well-armed, extra-legal dictatorship. The gold rush had not just created a land without law, it had created a land where powerful men became the law.
Chapter 8: The War Against the Other. The dream of the gold rush, promoted as a democratic enterprise open to all, quickly soured when faced with the reality of competition. The white American miners, who considered themselves the rightful inheritors of this new American land, were not prepared to share. They saw the thousands of other gold seekers pouring in from around the world, not as fellow pioneers, but as rivals and threats. This simmering resentment exploded into systemic, violent racism. The first targets were the experienced miners from Mexico, often labeled Sonorans, and Chile. These men were often more skilled prospectors than the Americans, having grown up in mining cultures. Their success bred a furious jealousy. American miners would hold meetings, form armed mobs, and forcibly drive the Hispanic miners from their claims. Men were beaten, their camps burned, and some were lynched under the flimsiest of pretexts. To give this racism the veneer of law, the new California state legislature, formed in 1850, passed the Foreign Miners Tax. The law required all miners who were not U.S. citizens to pay an exorbitant monthly tax of $20, equivalent to over $700 today. The law was specifically and brutally enforced against the Chinese and Hispanic miners, while European immigrants, Irish, German, French, were often ignored. It was a crippling, impossible tax designed not to raise revenue, but to drive foreigners from the goldfields. Thousands of Mexican, Chilean, and Chinese miners, unable to pay, were forced to abandon their claims and flee to the cities, where they were relegated to low-paying service jobs, their dreams of gold shattered by organized prejudice. The Chinese, who began arriving in large numbers by 1851, faced a particularly virulent form of racism. They were seen as bizarre and heathen, and their incredible work ethic and communal efficiency were viewed as an economic threat. They were relegated to working played-out claims that white miners had already abandoned. Even then, they were subjected to constant harassment, their long, traditional queues, or braids, often cut off by drunken thugs, their camps burned, and their testimony barred in any court case involving a white man. But the most horrific and tragic victims of the gold rush were the native people of California. Their story is not one of exclusion, it is one of outright genocide. Before 1848, an estimated 150,000 Native Americans lived in California. By 1870, fewer than 30,000 remained. The 49ers bringing with them a frontier mentality that viewed Indians as subhuman obstacles, descended upon their ancestral lands like a plague. The miners' operations destroyed the rivers, killing the salmon that had been a primary food source. Their mules and cattle ate the native grasses and acorns. Starvation became a constant threat. But worse than this was the direct, calculated violence. The miners, with no legal authority and often drunk, formed volunteer militias for the explicit purpose of Indian hunting. They would raid peaceful villages, slaughtering men, women, and children. In one infamous incident, the Clear Lake Massacre of 1850, a U.S. Army cavalry detachment murdered as many as 200 Pomo Indians, mostly women and children, in retaliation for the killing of 2 white settlers. The new state government actively encouraged this extermination. The legislature passed laws that essentially legalized the enslavement of Native Americans, allowing white settlers to take Indian children as apprentices, or slaves, and actioning off vagrant Indians as forced labor. The state subsidized the private militias, paying out bounties for the scalps and heads of Native Americans. The gold rush for the native people of California was an apocalypse. It was a systematic and state-sanctioned campaign of terror that erased them from their own land, all in the name of progress and gold. Chapter 9: The Forgotten Victims. While the story of the gold rush is dominated by the image of the male 49er, its most profound impacts were often felt by those left on the margins, the women who were left behind, the few who dared to come, and the land itself. For every man who rushed to California, a family was often left in a state of precarious limbo back east. These widows of the gold rush were left to manage farms, run businesses, and raise children alone for years, living on the thin hope of letters and a small poke of gold dust that might never arrive. Many husbands never returned, perishing on the journey or in the diggings, leaving their families destitute. The few women who did come to California found themselves in a bizarre and dangerous world where they were outnumbered nearly 50 to 1. This scarcity gave them a kind of power and a terrible kind of vulnerability. A woman who could provide domestic skills, cooking, laundry, or running a boarding house, could make a fortune. One woman in a mining camp claimed to make more money baking pies, which she sold for an outrageous $5 apiece, than her husband made digging for gold. But this world was also filled with predators. With few legal protections, women were constant targets of harassment and violence. Prostitution was rampant, becoming one of the most profitable and tragic businesses in San Francisco and the camps. Many women who had arrived with husbands or fathers, who subsequently died or abandoned them, were left with no other means of survival. The final victim of the gold rush was the land itself. The environmental devastation was absolute and would scar California for a century. The hydraulic mining operations of the 1850s and 60s were the greatest culprit. These water cannons didn't just wash away hillsides, they unleashed millions of tons of mud, gravel, and toxic heavy metals, like mercury, which was used to separate the gold from the silt, into the river systems. This slickens, as the toxic mud was called, flowed downstream, choking the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. The riverbeds were raised by dozens of feet, destroying salmon spawning grounds and decimating a once thriving fishing industry. The silt overflowed the riverbanks, burying thousands of acres of fertile farmland in the Sacramento Valley
under a sterile layer of mud and gravel, ruining the agricultural empire John Sutter had once dreamed of. The great, beautiful rivers of California, which had once run clear, were turned into muddy, poisonous sluices. The gold, when it was finally extracted, left a permanent toxic legacy on the land itself, a price that is still being paid today.
Part 4. The Dream's Reckoning. Chapter 10. The 49er becomes the Californian. The gold rush, as a chaotic, individualistic stampede, was remarkably short-lived. By 1853, the surface gold was gone, the rivers were claimed and dammed, and the future of mining lay in the hands of corporations with the capital for hydraulic cannons and quartz milling machinery. The lone prospector with his mule and pan was already a romantic myth. But the 300,000 people who had come were now here, and they had to build a society. The most urgent task was creating a government. The lawless, disorganized territory, still under military rule, was wholly unequipped to handle the massive, sudden population. In 1849, in a move of remarkable speed and self-interest, the leading citizens of California, mostly merchants, ranchers, and lawyers, not miners, organized a constitutional convention in Monterey. Bypassing the usual process of becoming a territory, they drafted a state constitution and applied directly to Congress for statehood. The debate in Washington was furious, not over gold, but over slavery. The new Constitution, written by a mix of Northerners and Southerners, controversially banned slavery. This was not born from a moral conviction, it was an economic one. The white miners, who already hated the competition from Mexicans and Chinese, refused to compete with enslaved African Americans. They feared that wealthy Southerners would bring in gangs of slaves to work the goldfields, shutting out the free white laborer. This provision threatened to shatter the fragile balance of power between slave and free states in the U.S. Senate. The debate raged, threatening to split the Union. It was only resolved by the Compromise of 1850, a complex and desperate political bargain. To appease the South, Congress passed the brutal new Fugitive Slave Act. In exchange, to appease the North, California was admitted to the Union as the 31st state, a free state. The gold rush had, in its chaotic, unintentional way, accelerated the political crisis over slavery, pushing the nation one giant step closer to the Civil War. With statehood came attempts at order, but the new state was born from the DNA of the gold rush. It was impatient, individualistic, violent, and deeply materialistic. San Francisco became its nerve center, a city of astonishing wealth and equally astonishing corruption. Fortunes were not just made in mining, they were made in land speculation, in monopolies on shipping and railroads. A group of 4 Sacramento shopkeepers, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, who became known as the Big Four, would leverage their gold rush profits to build the Central Pacific Railroad, becoming the unelected kings of the new state, their corporate power eclipsing that of the government itself. The 49er was no longer a temporary visitor. He was a Californian, and he was building a society that reflected the values of the hunt: fast, opportunistic, and ruthless. Chapter 11. The Men Who Lost It All. The gold rush was a tide that lifted a few boats to unimaginable heights while swamping thousands of others. For the 2 men who started it all, the flood was a personal catastrophe. James W. Marshall, the quiet carpenter who had first seen the glint of gold, was haunted by his discovery. He was neither a businessman nor a ruthless operator. He was simply a skilled mechanic. As the gold seekers flooded onto the Rivera River, they overran his sawmill, stole his tools, and diverted his water. His business was ruined. He tried to prospect himself, but he was no more or less lucky than any other man. He was, however, infamous. Miners followed him, believing he had a supernatural knack for finding gold. They would watch him, and as soon as he started to dig, they would swarm his claim, insisting he share his luck. He became a bitter, wandering figure, drifting from camp to camp, increasingly dependent on alcohol. He was recognized everywhere, but respected nowhere. He tried to profit from his fame by going on lecture tours, but he was a poor public speaker, and the public quickly lost interest. He died in 1885, a lonely, impoverished man in a small, crude cabin, supported by a meager pension from the state legislature that recognized him as the discoverer. He was buried on a hill overlooking the site of his sawmill, the place where his world-changing, life-ruining discovery had occurred. John Sutter, the Lord of New Helvetia, suffered a far more spectacular fall. His premonition of ruin was horrifically accurate. The thousands of squatters who poured into the Sacramento Valley showed no respect for his Mexican land grant. They stole his cattle for food, trampled his vast fields of wheat, and simply took his land parcel by parcel. His agricultural empire, the dream of his life, collapsed within 2 years. He spent the rest of his life and his considerable remaining fortune in a maddening, decades-long legal battle to get the U.S. courts to recognize his original land grant and evict the squatters. He pursued his claims all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1855, the court technically ruled in his favor, but the decision was unenforceable. The U.S. government, bowing to the political power of the 300,000 new voters, refused to send the army to evict them. Sutter, like Marshall, became a figure of pity. He too turned to alcohol. Bankrupt and broken, he moved to Washington, D.C., a white-bearded, pathetic figure haunting the halls of Congress, begging for a pension, a symbolic payment for the empire that had been stolen from him. He died in 1880, just 2 days after Congress had once again adjourned without granting his petition. The gold rush, which had been born on his land, had devoured him and everything he had built, leaving him with nothing. Chapter 12. The World Remade. The California gold rush, as a mass migration, was largely over by 1855, but its consequences had permanently remade America and the world. It had, in just a few years, accomplished what decades of slow, steady pioneering could not. It populated the West Coast. It pulled the center of American gravity westward, transforming the nation from an Atlantic-facing republic into a true continental empire that spanned from sea to shining sea. It fueled one of the most explosive economic booms in human history. An estimated $2 billion worth of gold, over $70 billion in 2024 money, was extracted in its first 2 decades. This massive injection of hard currency stabilized the U.S. economy, funded the Union's efforts in the Civil War, and financed the next great national obsession, the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad, in turn, would tie the new, rich state of California firmly to the rest of the nation, ending its isolation. It also changed the very idea of the dream. The old American dream was the Puritan or Jeffersonian ideal, to find freedom and success through hard work, piety, and the slow accumulation of property. The gold rush offered a new, intoxicating, and dangerous alternative, the dream of the big strike. It was the idea that wealth was not something to be slowly built, but something to be won, like a lottery ticket. It was the belief that a man could, in a single moment of luck, vault from poverty to unimaginable riches. This new gambler's mentality, this get-rich-quick ethos, would become a permanent and defining feature of the American character. But this new wealth came at a staggering human and environmental cost. It had been built on the genocide of the native population, the violent exclusion of non-white immigrants, and the permanent destruction of the landscape. The gold rush was the story of America in miniature, a story of boundless optimism and opportunity, inextricably linked with ruthless violence, racial prejudice, and a near total disregard for the natural world. California, the golden child of the gold rush, was born with this dual legacy seared into its very soul.
Part 5. The Epilogue. Ghosts of the Gold Rush. Chapter 13. The Fading Fever. The gold rush, as a distinct historical event, did not so much end as it transformed. The fever that had seized the world in 1849 burned white-hot for less than a decade. By the late 1850s, the game had changed. The lone miner with his pan was a relic, replaced by industrial mining corporations that blasted mountains apart with hydraulic cannons and burrowed deep into the earth with stamp mills that crushed quartz. The men who had come for a quick fortune were forced to make a hard choice: return home defeated if they could afford the passage, or stay and become something new. Many became wage laborers, working for the very corporations that now owned the mines, a bitter irony for men who had come west to be their own masters. They became farmhands in the vast new agricultural valleys, loggers in the northern forests, or shopkeepers in the booming cities. The 49er died, and the Californian was born, a new identity forged in hustle, disappointment, and a relentless drive to rebuild. San Francisco, the city built on mud and fire, solidified from a chaotic camp into a gaudy, ostentatious metropolis. The instant wealth of the gold rush and the subsequent silver strikes in Nevada, the Comstock Lode, funneled unimaginable fortunes into the city. Nob Hill became a monument to this new corporate aristocracy, where the Big Four railroad barons built garish mansions, looking down on the city they now controlled. Chapter 14. The Price of the Dream. The legacy of the gold rush is one of profound and violent contradictions. It was, without question, the catalyst that built the American West. It pulled the United States across the continent, fulfilled the dream of manifest destiny, and transformed a remote, sparsely populated territory into a global economic powerhouse in the span of 5 years. It financed the industrialization of a nation. The billions of dollars in gold extracted from the Sierra Nevada fueled the Union's victory in the Civil War, backed the new greenback currency, and paid for the steel rails that would soon tie the continent together. But this incredible creation came at a cost of equally incredible destruction. For the Native American people of California, it was nothing short of an apocalypse. The 300,000 miners who invaded their lands were not settlers. They were an army of occupation. In the hunt for gold, they systematically destroyed the native food supply, the salmon-filled rivers, the oak groves, and the game. But worse, they brought a wave of genocidal violence, encouraged and funded by the new state government. In just 2 decades, the native population plummeted from an estimated 150,000 to less than 30,000 through massacres, enslavement, and starvation. It remains one of the darkest, most brutal chapters in American history. For the environment, the gold rush was a catastrophe from which California has never fully recovered. Hydraulic mining, the terrible giant, blasted away entire mountains and sent millions of tons of toxic mud, gravel, and mercury used to extract the gold into the river systems. This slickens, choked the rivers, destroyed vast tracts of farmland, and poisoned the water. The beautiful, clear-running rivers of the Sierra Nevada were turned into lifeless, muddy drains, and the mercury remains in the sediment of the San Francisco Bay to this day. And for the vast majority of the 49ers, the dream was a lie. Most arrived too late, found claims that were already played out, or lacked the capital to compete. The statistics are grim. It is estimated that less than 5% of the people who came to the gold rush ever found significant wealth. Many returned home with nothing, their health broken and their spirits crushed. Many more never returned at all, their bones buried in shallow graves along the trails, in the malarial swamps of Panama, or in the lonely, lawless camps of the Motherlode. The gold rush, in the end, was a lottery. It created a new world, but it did so with a savagery and speed that left a permanent scar on the land and its people. It established the California dream, a potent mixture of boundless opportunity, reinvention, and the intoxicating belief in a second chance, but it also embedded a darker code that in the race for wealth, ruthlessness is a virtue, and the winner takes all.